To discuss the current situation in Syria, we're joined now by David Lesch, Professor of Middle East History at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. He's the author of a book about President al-Assad and modern Syria. David Lesch, welcome to Lateline.
My pleasure.
With virtually all the foreign media banned and so little access to Syria, what's the latest information that you've got about these protests and the crackdown?
Well, it's partly the fault of the regime that they are banning these the media, and so therefore we're left with very little information. I think the regime is cracking down in a more intense fashion, especially with the military, as a show of force to dissuade other groups in other towns from rising up. It also wants to show that it's not weak, so that if it announces any more reforms in the near future, it's doing so from a position of strength rather than weakness. In addition, they're also showing, I think, most of the Syrians that the army is solidly behind the regime and cannot be separated from the regime, as happened in Egypt. It's a very dangerous, critical phase right now for the opposition and the regime itself, because with each death that occurs in Syria, the opposition's position hardens, they become more bold, and their demands escalate from what had been reforms to now being the elimination of the Assad regime. Now, and that's dangerous for the regime because there's no compromised solution, there's no negotiated solution. Now, it's dangerous for the opposition as well, because if the regime is put in the position of being eliminated or survival, they're going to pick the latter and they'll do what's necessary in order to survive.
Well, indeed. I mean, do you think, given the force that's being used, will this crackdown effectively stamp out the protests? Will it stop the momentum?
It can. I mean, the Syrian regime has the force to brutally repress the opposition in the near term, and the regime will survive, and I think they know that, especially because the international community has very little leverage over Syria. And it's a careful calibration. How much force do you use to crack down on the protesters without attracting more attention from the international community and becoming a Libyan-type situation? However, in the long term, this is not going to help the Syrian regime or President Bashar al-Assad. He's lost a great deal of goodwill that he really had in the country and in the region, and goodwill that he was building in the international community over the last few years. In addition, he's lost a great deal of legitimacy in the country. Everyone thought he was different. He was different from his father, and what many people, particularly the important silent majority in Syria, are realizing that perhaps he's not different from his father. He's perhaps the typical, brutal Middle East dictator that has become, a characteristic of in this part of the world. So, in addition, economically, they depend on foreign investment. They depend on tourism more and more to try to reach that 5%, growth level every year to provide enough jobs for this youth bulge in the country that's affected other Arab countries as well. And they're not going to get that if they become an international pariah state, isolated and delegitimized in the region.
As we've said, you've met the president on a number of occasions, and there was, when he came to power, also, as you said, in 2000, there was that Damascus Spring. People did think he'd be a reformist. What's he like as an individual? Does he have the ability to reform, or is he, to some extent, captured by the various interest groups that, fundamentally want to see the status quo?
Yeah, I think he has a desire to reform, particularly in the economic and business realm, and he has done a lot in the country in terms of opening up the country to foreign investment, fiscal, monetary reform, a new stock exchange, private banks, but the political reform has lagged far behind. And in that, I think his commitment is somewhat specious. This is not to deny the difficulty of reform in Syria. Things happen incrementally, step by step. I mean, he bemoaned to me on one occasion when I met him that he had signed 4,000 decrees and only 10 had been implemented, even though he's trying to reform the ministries to become more efficient, because there's kind of this institutional and cultural inertia against change. And so change is very difficult. Even the smallest of reforms, much less the larger reforms that he's been trying to implement and that he's announced in the past few weeks, there are pockets of resistance. He has to negotiate, bargain with, manipulate. But he's had 10 years, on the other hand, to surround himself with loyalists. So if he can't line them up in a row to implement the reforms he's announced, either he's really not interested in the reforms as much as he said, or he doesn't have the power, enough power to get everybody lined up behind him to implement these reforms.
Is there any question that the orders for this bloody crackdown are coming from him? Are the military and the security forces and the government in lockstep?
That's a difficult question. We don't know for sure. I think at a personal level, he would rather this not happen. I mean, he's expressed on Syrian television that that the killing should stop. Yet they've continued on. So that raises the question of who really is in control. Or has he been persuaded by the general, so to speak, that a crackdown is in fact necessary, that they are in survival mode, and first things first before they implement reforms later on, and they're not even worrying about the outcry of the international community because they have to survive first and foremost.
So who are the protesters? Who are the demonstrators? As far as you can tell, is it a broad-based opposition? Does it cut across sectarian lines?
Yeah, it's not a monolithic group. There are different sets of objectives. There are different sets of grievances, which is typical in many of these revolutions or protest movements that we've seen in the Middle East recently and in the past. But they tend to coalesce around one idea, and that is getting rid of the regime. And that is what is happening right now. So it's a broad base of groups, and they are being stirred up by elements from the outside, Syrian expatriates, Syrian exiles who are against the Assad regime, and others, and possibly even Islamic radical groups. But the regime focusing on the external aspects tend to deny the real socioeconomic and political problems in the country that are at the root of the despair and the protests to date. But again, the more and more the regime cracks down, I think it plays into the hands of the opposition, and more they will coalesce around the idea that the regime of Bashar al-Assad has to go.
But I guess the question then becomes, are the protesters armed? Do they have the means to pursue their case? What do you see as being the next step?
Well, it's interesting because the protesters have become more bold, much more so than in the past when there have been some disturbances in Syria over the past 20, 30 years. They do have access to arms. There are weapons depots in Lebanon and Iraq across porous borders and the regime has already announced that it's stopped a number of weapons crossing the borders to try to arm the protesters. There are elements from the outside that will fund and try to support as much as possible various elements of the protest groups. And I think the will is there. I mean, they're calling for an end to the regime. They're calling for a dismantling of the security force system, the security state. And that's much beyond what they've done in the past. So it seems that the wall of fear has been broken. And, of course, there's the precedent of success in Tunisia, in Egypt. It appears to be the same in Yemen and probably in Libya. So with the new social media, which is kind of the weapon of mass destruction for the youth these days, the regimes in the Middle East, the authoritarian regimes, cannot control the stream of information. And this will keep the protests alive and, of course, allow them to become more bold. And so you could see a period of prolonged crackdowns, spasmodic protests that will eventually, I think, weaken the base of the regime, alienate the middle class, the very strong and important Sunni business class in Syria from the regime because of the economic difficulties of a prolonged instability.
You talked earlier about the fact that the international community has little leverage, and I guess Syria is a pivotal country in the Middle East, isn't it? It's up against Lebanon and Turkey and Iraq and Jordan and Israel. What's the view in those countries, and how fearful would they be of a breakdown in centralised control in Syria?
Well, that's what everyone is fearing. I read an article yesterday where a writer compared Syria to some of the failed financial institutions in the United States in 2008, that they were too big to fail. Even though that they were corrupt and oftentimes criminal, their collapse would cause even more problems than not bailing them out. And it seems to be the case here that many in the international community and in the region itself fear the collapse of central authority, even under Bashar al-Assad in Syria, because it is ethnically and religiously diverse, a la Lebanon and Iraq, and it could devolve into political chaos or political instability that could have serious ramifications for the security of Turkey, for the security of Lebanon, Iraq, U.S. troops in Iraq, Israel, Jordan. So, most of the international community in the United States in particular have taken a measured approach. their stance has grown a little bit tougher of late. They've been compelled to do so because of the regime's crackdown and enhanced crackdown. But we have very little leverage, except if the EU countries get on board with the United States and enhance sanctions or participate in economic sanctions, because a quarter or 25% of Syria's trade is with the EU countries, and that could have a direct effect, maybe not so much in the near term, but certainly in the long term.
So do you believe that certainly the EU and America is most likely to go that route, and that they would absolutely rule out doing anything along the lines of what's happening in Libya?
I don't think they're going to rule it out, just to give that sense of unpredictability to the Syrian regime, that they can't get away with anything. I think what the Libyan precedent said is that if the Syrian regime continues to do and enhance its crackdown to the level of what Gaddafi did in Libya, maybe there will be calls for military intervention. And if Europe and the United States are speaking with one voice, that makes that prospect more likely rather than less likely. And in the past, Syria has been able to exploit differences between Europe and the United States, particularly during the Bush administration. They survived international pariah status before. They survived international pressure and isolation from the United States. Perhaps they feel they can survive again, but not if the EU and the United States and some Arab states, and the Arab League has grown a little bit more closer in recent statements to condemning the regime in Syria and condemning the crackdown. If they all get on the same page, then perhaps that will encourage the Syrian regime to back down and actually seriously negotiate with protesters or elements of the opposition and engage in real reform.
David Lesch, we thank you very much for giving us your insights this evening.